talk a little bit about oil painting. So you want to oil paint. There's a lot that goes into oil painting. I'm going to show you how to get started. First thing you want is to get some brushes, and I will give these to you, that are meant for oil painting. They are a little bit more coarse than your typical acrylic brush. Next thing you're going to need is a jar full of mineral spirits or terpenoid. Okay. This is something called odorless paint thinner. It is used in place of water when oil painting. Obviously, oil and water do not mix, so in order to thin your paints, you need to use something called paint thinner or something called turpentine or terpenoid. This is odorless, so it's not going to give you like a headache. There's not going to be a lot of fumes. And you will get a jar just like this filled with your turpentine. That is what you'll use to thin your paint and clean your brushes. Something else that you'll use a little bit later on in your painting is something called artist painting medium. This is a material that will actually cause your oil paints to dry even slower than they already dry, whereas mixing with turpentine will increase drying time and dry things faster. Okay, so those are just some tools that you're going to need when oil painting. With handling the oil paints, I would just put on a pair of gloves, and I would wear these all through the class period just to reduce cleanup time in the end. When you get oil paint on your hands, because it is not water soluble, cleaning up oil paint on your skin is very harsh. So I would just recommend gloves right off the bat for the entire time that you're using them. That way you can just take them off and they can easily be discarded when you are finished. The experimentation process. We'll do that by using something called canvas paper. Canvas paper is great for practicing any sort of acrylic or oil paint without having to commit to an actual canvas. Canvases are expensive. This canvas paper is cheap. So we're going to use this for any experimentation we want to do. See, I have this piece of newsprint laid under my work surface. You're going to want to do this anytime you use oils. You do not want to get any on the table just because they're so messy. So if you want to reduce the amount of cleanup, we will always have a piece of newsprint under us as we're working. So the first thing we need to do with oil painting is we actually need to prime the surface of our paper or our canvas. This is because oil paint it's a natural type of paint. Unlike your acrylic paint that is made, it's like a synthetic material. Oil paint actually has like natural oils in it, and over time it will eat through the surface of your canvas or your paper. So in order to prevent that from happening, we actually have to prime the surface. To prime the surface, you use something called gesso. Gesso comes in a variety of colors, and you can actually tint your gesso as well. We have white here, we have a clear gesso, and we also have a black gesso. And this could be used for a variety of different reasons, the black, the clear, or the white. I'm just going to go with the white. Okay. And I'm actually just going to put it on some palette paper. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paint the surface area where I'm going to be painting using the oils. So I'm not going to coat the entire paper just because I'm not going to be using it all with oils, but any surface that's going to come in contact with your oil paint, you're going to need to go ahead and prime using the gesso. Okay, you want to try to get it nice and smooth, get all of your brush strokes out. I know it's hard to see on the video because I am painting a white material onto a white piece of paper, but you know, I would go vertically, I would go horizontally, just try to get it as streak-free as possible. Okay? The gesso will dry in a matter of minutes. It is water-soluble, and that should be good to go. One thing you want to make sure you do is immediately rinse out your gesso brush. Because it has plaster in it, it will ruin the brush if you let it dry. Now that my gesso is dry, it's time to move on to the next step. The next step is actually adding your background color before we go ahead and start experimenting with the oil paint. Now, this is optional, but I would highly recommend it. I'm actually going to use an acrylic paint in yellow oxide for my background color. The reason I would want to apply acrylic paint as my base color is because acrylic paint dries very quickly. If you apply oil paint as your back color, you're going to have to wait several days for it to dry before you can actually paint on top of it. So you can, in fact, use oil and acrylics in combination. You cannot mix them together. That would be very bad. But you can use acrylic paints underneath your oils, but you do not want to use acrylics over your oils. So I'm going to actually start by giving a nice background color of this yellow oxide. The reason I use yellow oxide as the ground, and that word ground just means my background or my undercoating. The reason I use the yellow oxide is because it is a nice neutral color. It's warm, and I'll never actually see it once I paint everything on top of it, but it just takes away that white, stark white space, and it's a good kind of starting color. Right? Again, the acrylic paint needs to be mixed and thinned with water. Do not use the turpentine to thin out acrylic paint. That is just for your oils. All right, now that I have my ground color down in acrylic, I'm going to go ahead now and let that area dry. So we're ready to start with the oil paint. As you can see, I've drawn my practice on there, which is this pepper that I'm looking at. I would suggest looking at something in the classroom just to get some practice down first. Do not forget, you want to be wearing gloves when you're doing this. Wear them all period, even when you're cleaning up. It'll just really reduce cleanup at the end of the period and protect your skin from kind of the harshness of the oil paints. All right, so oil paint comes in tubes, just like this. The metal around the tube is a lot thicker than, say, in acrylic paint, just because the oil paint will eat through anything that's not like a metal. So you'll never find them in like plastic containers. Okay. You want to grab some palette paper. I would just keep the entire book on your shelf, and just, the great thing about oil paint is that it will stay wet for a really long time. Like a blob like this will probably stay wet for at least a week, and you can just come back and rework with it. Okay, so I got all the colors that I kind of need for right now. I have my brushes, I have a palette knife. You may want to get several palette knives. And of course I have my turpentine, which I'm going to need to thin down my paints. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is create something called a glaze. And a glaze is basically, I want to build up layers of my oil paint. And the reason I do this is because of the drying time. Okay. When you apply the oil paint, so I'm going to go ahead and mix the color that I want right now. When I apply the oil paint to my canvas paper, I want to start with a thinned out layer. Okay, this is called lean. Whenever you mix your turpentine in with your paint, you're creating a more lean paint. The paint directly out of the tube is called fat paint. Okay? So as I create a paint that's more lean with more turpentine in it, I make it dry faster. Okay? So think of your turpentine as your water. Okay? I can go ahead and dip in. Okay. And you can see I'm creating like a transparent layer as the first coat of my drawing. Okay? And this is called glazing. Anytime I can kind of see the color underneath the work. It's called glazing or washing. Okay. Change my color here because I want to go into like a green for this top part of my pepper, this green and yellowy color. I'm going to need to clean off my brush. Okay, in order to change colors, I'm going to go ahead and twirl my brush around there, and I'm going to need a paper towel as well. clean that off. And now I'm ready to change into my green color. So I think I'm going to keep the paint nice and lean. Okay, so now you can see I have kind of my colors laid in with some value for my shadows, and it's all just a wash. It's very lean paint mixed with a lot of turpentine. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and let this dry. We'll talk more about building up layers in the next video, but for now, this will take you to a good place to stop, remembering the first thing we need to do in this process is gesso our paper, paint the ground color on using an acrylic paint so it dries quickly, drawing on whatever we're going to paint. And I have tons of things around the room you can choose from just for practice. So like a piece of fake fruit is perfect, or a flower, or any of the still lifes at the tables. Pick an object from there. At that point, you're going to draw it onto your ground, and then you're going to go ahead and prepare your paints and create a thin, lean wash over your object. Okay? Now we're going to talk about the cleanup process, because it is a little bit different than using acrylics. Right? What you want to do for the cleanup process is take your brushes and initially first rinse them with the turpentine and get them as clean as possible. And then you'll wipe them off on a piece of paper towel. At this point, because you're using the paint so lean, it shouldn't be too difficult to get the paint off. Same thing goes with your palette knife. You'll mix it into your turpentine, wipe it off with a paper towel. All right, at this point, you want to take your tools, head over to the sink, right behind me. And what you're going to do now, bring this over, is you're going to take this paint cleaner and you're going to wet your brushes in some water, and you're going to go ahead and swirl them into the paint cleaner. In which case, with your hand, you'll just kind of rub them into your palm with the glove on, and then rinse them in the sink. At that point, your brushes are nice and clean. Same with your palette knife. You may just want to rinse that under the sink. And then these brushes that you're using can just be kept on your shelf because they are specially designed for the oil paint. Okay? Everything else here can go on your shelf. So you can put this jar of turpentine that can go directly onto your shelf. These can be reused the next day. So just don't rip the paper off. Just put the entire book of palette paper on your shelf in a place where it's not going to get on anything else, because that will create quite a mess. And then this paper that you're working with, this newsprint underneath, that can just go, it can go in the trash if it's messy. If it's not messy and you want to reuse it the next day, you can also put that on your shelf as well. And we will go through the process of building up more layers in the next video that we watch.